Good afternoon. Before I begin, I feel like I have to respond to these vicious allegations by a certain Jason Grigsby, and I'll ask you a simple question. What's more plausible, that I somehow summoned voodoo to tear someone's ACL, or someone faked an ACL injury to avoid getting out of... Yeah, right, even applause. You hear that, Jason? So, okay. Now that we have that out of the way. Once upon a time, there were these heavy paper things called books, and these books consisted of pages, right? And this notion of the page that's been around for a couple millennia now has been really baked into the language of the web since the very beginning, right? You know, we talk about how many web pages our sites consist of, right? This web page failed to load. Brad, how long is the home page going to take to build, right? And this language very much influences how we go about doing our jobs. But now, of course, we all know this is our reality, right? We have all these different devices, all these different scenarios, environments, browser sizes, screen sizes, widths, and so on and so forth, input methods. So this notion of the page just doesn't really sort of hold up anymore. Just out of morbid curiosity, does anybody work at a place that has to make multiple comps like this, right? Anybody? This is a safe place. It's okay. It's all right, right? But it's always, you know, it's always the iPhone, it's always the iPad, and it's always like a MacBook Pro or MacBook Air, if someone's feeling especially saucy, like a 27-inch iMac, right? And this is what we show our clients, and it's like, look, this is what responsive design is, right? We tilt them slightly to get that ooh factor, you know, from the client. So, but this just doesn't work. This just doesn't scale. This is nothing more than just a tremendous waste of a talented designer's time. So I think we literally have to blow up this notion of designing pages. And quite literally, though, also blowing up our interfaces themselves, right? And really, we have to ask ourselves this question, you know, what are our interfaces made of, right? What are our UIs made of? What are the web's Lego bricks? What are the web's Subway sandwich pieces that we combine together into all these different combinations, right? We're not designing pages. We're designing systems of components, right? This is how we have to approach UI design in 2015 and beyond. Anybody use Foundation by Zurb or play around with it or anything? Yeah, all right. Where are my Bootstrap people at? Oh, look at all those hands. Woo. But this is what these things provide, right? These systems of components, right? These UI toolkits that allow us to sort of just assemble these components together, you know, to form whatever UI we want. I love these things. I love these things in theory, right? Again, we're getting away from pages and into this more sort of systematic design. This is my problem with Bootstrap. So look at all these happy people here. And like, whenever I'd watch sci-fi movies as a kid, I could never sort of shake this notion from my head. I'm like, I guess just like if given enough time, we solve fashion. Some person's like, hey, how about we just wear jumpsuits from now on? And everybody's like, sure. I'm fine with that. Check, right? Let's move on to the next thing. But of course, you know, we as human beings, we all have, you know, different needs. We all have different desires, different wants, different goals. You know, so this notion of sort of like a one-size-fits-all solution just doesn't necessarily make sense or lead to the best results, right? And that's what these solutions like Bootstrap and stuff give us, right? That, like what Jen talks about, the sameness, you know, we see the same layout over and over again. Well, it's because, you know, half the internet's using Bootstrap, right? So it's, you know, and again, that's not to say that conceptually using a UI framework or something is a bad idea. It's just about keeping these things in mind, right? If Nike, Adidas, Puma, Reebok were to all redesign their sites using Bootstrap, they would look substantially similar, right? That's sort of not what they're going for. These frameworks give us a lot of stuff. Sometimes they give us too much stuff, and we don't end up using it, right? But our users have to incur all that extra downloaded stuff, right? Which Laura and Jasenia have been talking about, bad for performance. On the flip side, they might not go far enough, and you have to write custom and design custom stuff anyways, right? How do you work this sort of system into your existing framework? And I'd say also very importantly, you have to subscribe to how someone else has called their modules, their components, right? Bootstrap has something called Jumbotron. Like, does that make sense for your organization? Maybe, maybe not. So Dave Rupert, local Austin celebrity, right? I'm pretty sure. Paravel, great design agency. They did a redesign of Microsoft.com. And Dave talked about what they delivered to their clients. And it brought up this really wonderful shorthand for this. There's tiny bootstraps for every client. And he said that responsive deliverables, right, should look a lot like fully functioning Twitter Bootstrap style systems, custom tailored for your client's needs, right? That last part is the operative part there, right? Custom tailored for your client's needs. It's not just about using a design system like Bootstrap. It's about taking the time to craft your own design system, right? One that makes sense for your organization or for your clients, that solves their specific problems. So that's what's given rise to all of these pattern libraries, style guides. Anna Debenham calls them front-end style guides, right? And so building your own tiny bootstraps. And these things are fantastic, and I love seeing them. They promote consistency and cohesion across your entire user experience, right? They make testing easier, right? Testing for accessibility, testing for performance, testing for just basic usability and things like that. Establish a better workflow between all the different people involved in a team, right? Creating this shared vocabulary. So whenever somebody says, oh, the utility bar, right? Everyone knows what that is, right? So you don't get these sort of different language for the same thing. Right? It's a useful reference to keep coming back to. And finally, pattern libraries provide this future-friendly foundation, right? This opportunity to live with your UI and learn from it and roll in best practices and new best practices into your design system and evolve it over time. There's a bunch of different tools out there to help create pattern libraries, style guides. Jeremy Keith, speaking later, has a nice one called Pattern Primer, loops through all of your different patterns and spits them out onto one page. Paul Robert Lloyd took that a step further with something he calls bare bones. Whenever you look, open these things up, you'll see there's a heading. Here's what paragraphs look like, small text, horizontal link lists, vertical link lists, so on and so forth. Here's what our forms look like. Here's what our inputs look like. Here's what notes about those inputs look like. Here's what our labels look like. Right? And so in addition to all these tools, there's all these different great style guides that have been released out into the wild. Code for Americas is particularly amazing. Definitely recommend checking that out. MailChimp has released now their, I think, like third or fourth iteration on this, which is really cool. Yelp released theirs. But it really all started with Starbucks. Has everybody seen this? These Starbucks style guides. So they went responsive like 3.5 years ago. And whenever they released their new site, alongside it, they released their style guide, right? Which documented all the patterns they used to create their site, right? So they have things like blocks 3 up, right? So here's this pattern. They're going to be using a bunch of different places. You're able to resize the browser and do all that stuff, test it in isolation, and see how it works across different viewports. Here's a features table, right, with a little thumbnail image, a headline, and an excerpt, right? Again, pretty common pattern. They're going to be using this a bunch of different places. You solve the problem once, and you can just recycle it. Data tables, right? Here's a little table, 3 columns, pretty easy. That's going to squish quite nicely onto small screens, right? But then here's a more complicated example, and how's that going to work on small screens? So I love these. Like, I think absolutely this is how we need to be approaching design and development projects. in 2015 and beyond. Anna Debon and I created a site called styleguides.io, which rounds up a lot of the different examples of style guides, articles, books, resources, talks, and so on and so forth. Have a podcast where we're interviewing people who have successfully implemented these things, so you can check that out. But so as great as these things are, they're time-consuming to create. I don't know about you, but I don't go into work every day going, wonder what I'm going to do today. Maybe I'll make a pattern library, right? It's like, no, we're under the gun to get stuff out the door, right? Everybody's like, yeah, ship it, it's already behind schedule, right? So this idea that a pattern library is somehow this sort of separate thing than the main project you're working on, sort of impedes progress, impedes these things from happening, right? Because when the going gets tough, it might sound nice to make a pattern library, but it's like, we just need to get this out the door, so sorry, we want to do this, but it's just going to die on the vine. Very often these pattern libraries are, they're great. They show, blocks 3 up, but you don't get an idea of where those things are actually utilized. What does that look like in context? Very often they're only seen as a designer or a developer tool, a best kept secret from the other disciplines within the organization. Very often they're only created after a project launches and only serving the present use cases, right? Maybe your organization doesn't do a lot of video work now, but maybe that becomes a bigger initiative down the road, right? Wouldn't it be nice to already have that pattern sorted ahead of time? And then the last thing, and this is the thing that I think I really latched onto, is that I felt that, I see all these style guides out there, and I'm like, these are fantastic, but at the same time, they just sort of felt like sort of loosely organized sprays of modules. And I'm like, maybe there's a way to sort of more deliberately create those modules, create these UI design systems. So that's what I'm calling atomic design. And whenever I was thinking about parallels, I'm like, well, surely there's some other areas that we could sort of pull from, for inspiration. And I kept coming back to my high school chemistry class and having to deal with atoms and molecules and stuff like that, right? So in the natural world, we have atoms, right, which are the basic building blocks of all matter, right? They can't be broken down any further without ceasing to be, functional or relevant. They're sort of an abstract concept. They're not terribly useful on their own, right? But these atoms combine together to form molecules, right? Hydrogen, oxygen join together, form a water molecule. Now, together, that takes on new properties, right? It can do new things. Those molecules keep combining together further into more complex molecules, which keep combining further into organisms, simple organisms, which keep combining further together into more complex organisms, like a human being. And I did a Google search for people, a Google image search, and this guy came up, and I'm like, yeah, that's about right. You're going in my talk. That was a good representation of a person. So all matter in the known universe, I kept him in there, is comprised of this finite set of atomic elements, right? And that's just a beautiful concept, right? Beautiful idea, right? The vastness and all the beauty in our universe is comprised of this sort of finite set of basic building blocks. And as it turns out, we on the web have this too. This guy, Josh Duck, who I think works at Facebook, came up with the periodic table of HTML elements, which I think is a pretty clever idea, right? It's like, so here's our form markup, here's our table markup, our text markup, and stuff like that. So I think that this is a really clever sort of representation of like HTML tags and stuff. But because we're starting with that same sort of finite set of building blocks, maybe we could apply that same process that happens in the natural world to our user interfaces. So that's what atomic design is it's this series, or I should say, a collection of these 5 stages that all sort of happen collectively and concurrently. It's not like a step 1, step 2, step 3 thing. It's just more a mental model about how to go about crafting not just our final UIs, but the underlying design systems that make them up. So 5 stages: atoms, molecules, organisms, templates, pages. Starting with atoms, right? Again, atoms in nature have their own unique properties. They can't be broken down any further. Sort of abstract, not terribly useful on their own. What are our atoms? Right? Things like labels, inputs, buttons, right? These things can't be broken down any further, but again, they're not terribly useful on their own. Right? Then we get to the molecule stage, and we're taking those atoms and combining them together to form these relatively simple components. Right? Now, all of a sudden, that label atom is defining that input. Now, all of a sudden, clicking that button will submit that form. Right? So you have this little encapsulated, relatively simple component that you could plug in wherever you need it. We get to the organism stage. We take this, right, take our search form molecule, right, and put that into context of a header organism, right? And we see this on like every website we ever go to, right? You go to a website and you're going to see a collection of relatively complex, proportions that are working as a single unit, right? A header, a footer, a main section, and it might be disparate elements like an image, an unordered list, a form or whatever, or it could be like a product grid, right? Organism sort of repeated over and over again, right? Then we get to templates. Right? So we take these relatively complex components, right? And now we put them, the header organism, into context of something that resembles a page layout, right? So the big thing here is that this isn't the final stage, even though we're started getting into the language of our deliverables, what users are expecting and stuff like that. We're starting to see that full picture come together. But the big thing here is that we're focusing on that underlying content structure. Right? What are the image widths of that hero, right? What are the character lengths of our titles and so on and so forth, right? It's about seeing that sort of content scaffolding, that content skeleton laid bare. And then finally, at the page stage, what we're doing is we're taking that content skeleton defined in the template, and we're pouring in real representative content into that template, right? Now, obviously, this is an important stage in the process because this is ultimately what your users are going to interact with. And this is ultimately what your clients are going to sign off on and what your colleagues are going to be reviewing and all of that stuff, right? But this stage is also tremendously important to test the underlying sort of, the resiliency of those underlying patterns, of those underlying molecules and organisms, right? What happens when you pour real content into your templates, right? Into these patterns. Do they hold up? Yes or no, right? And if things look look wonky or functionality breaks or whatever, you need to go back and solve that at a more atomic level, right? And pages also give us this opportunity to test variations of templates, right? What does it look like with a different hero image plugged into it? What does it look like if on the home page you have an alert, right? Your account was just hacked or something like that, right? It's still the same underlying template, but it's a variation of that template, right? So this page stage gives us that opportunity to show all the different instances of a particular template. So collectively, these 5 stages that all, again, it's more a mental model than it is like a step-by-step process. Like nobody's saying like design your buttons first in isolation and then cross your fingers and hope that it all comes together to form a cohesive whole, right? We need to simultaneously create the whole as well as the parts of that whole, right? And atomic design gives us a nice sort of framework with which to do that. So I've been working this way for about 2.5 years now. And what I like the most about it is that it gives me the opportunity, me and my teams, the opportunity to sort of traverse between abstract and concrete, right? I'm able to sort of see everything blown apart into its atomic bits and pieces, into those, elemental Lego blocks, but I'm also able to take those and sort of step through how all of those pieces come together to form the eventual final user experience. And I've also found that clients don't really give a crap about atoms and molecules and organisms, and that's okay. That's all right. And understandably so, they're like, how much is this going to cost me, right? They care more about the final product, and that's understandable, right? It's like they want to see what their new website looks like. But that hasn't stopped me from presenting this whole thing to them, right? Showing them that, yeah, we're not just making you a new shiny website, right? We're crafting you this really deliberate, really useful design system that you can use and reuse and extend and grow with over time, right? So even though they understandably care about what the end thing is going to look like, it's really important, I think, to expose them to this whole process. It's also important to understand that, we're all working on the web, but really this is just a mental framework, right? A methodology for really any UI, right? Your bank's kiosk, right? Microsoft Word, Instagram, right? So here we could see, Instagram sort of with atomic design applied to it, right? So at its core, what is Instagram? Well, you got some icons, right? You have a couple text level element things, and you have a couple image types, right? The user avatar image and the main image, and you're able to sort of see these simple components joined together to form these sections of the interface, right? And then at the organism stage, we really see the sort of meat and potatoes of Instagram's interface really shine, right? So here's this like photo organism, which is comprised of the avatar, the username, right? And then the photo, of course, itself, but then actions for that photo and the comments and the likes and stuff like that, right? So that is the cornerstone of Instagram's experience. And then we're able to put that together into the template, and then of course at the page stage we're able to pour in real representative content into that. So that's sort of the philosophy, the methodology, the sort of mental model. In order to actually make this happen, myself along with a guy named Dave Olson, who works at West Virginia University, we made a tool called Pattern Lab. And Pattern Lab is basically a tool. It's an open source tool, so it's free and whatever. But it's a way to sort of stitch together all of these atoms, molecules, organisms, templates, and pages to actually craft not just our final production front-end code, but also the underlying design system. The end goal of this is to have these tiny bootstraps for every client, right? This becomes our deliverable. It gives us some patterns to get started with and provides some other design tools that I'll talk about. What it isn't, though, is it's not Bootstrap, right? It's not Foundation by Zurb, right? You still have to do all that work yourself, right? You still have to do all the design and development yourself. Pattern Lab's just sort of there to help you stitch it all together. In fact, you could actually use Bootstrap or Foundation or whatever within Pattern Lab. It's not language, library, style, workflow dependent. You like Sass, cool, go for it. If you like jQuery, cool, go for it. If you don't like those things, that's fine too. It's not rigid. I talked to a lot of people, and in fact, just at lunch even, people are like, yeah, we like this stuff, but we don't like this whole terminology business. And I'm like, that's totally fine. I am not offended, as I cry into my pillow at night. But no, but it's fine. Like, it's about establishing the right language and vocabulary for you and your team. It's also not just the pattern library, because again, I've been using it to create production level front-end code, but it's also not a replacement for like Jekyll or WordPress or anything like that. You still have to plug your UI system into a content management system. So here's what it looks like. Looks like shit. Sort of intentional, actually, to really sort of drive home this point that it's like, yeah, you still need to do all this stuff yourself, right? We're not giving you any sort of aesthetic directions. We're just trying to give you a platform with which to sort of, traverse between all of your atoms, molecules, organisms, and so on. So starting with the atoms, right? We have things like our color palette, right? This is an elemental aspect of our user experiences, of our UIs, right? So it's good to articulate those in the context of a pattern library. Font stacks, also very elemental, very important to articulate. But even sort of invisible things like animations, right? Those are things that should probably be consistent throughout our UIs. So maybe that's a good idea to articulate those defaults within the context of our pattern library. But also, here's our headings, our paragraphs, block quotes, text elements, horizontal rules, lists, logos, big hero images, right? Square images, avatars, icon fonts, right? Spinners, fav icons, right? All of those sort of elemental building blocks that make up our UIs, buttons, form fields, tables, whatever. But again, the tool's just there to sort of give you, some stuff to get started with, but of course you could, add or remove things to your liking. So at the molecule stage, what we're doing is we're using Pattern Lab to create these reusable components. So this is a project I did for Time Inc., the big magazine publishing company, right? And so this is a pretty attractive looking pattern, if I do say so myself. It's actually pretty plain, right? But you have a title, you have an excerpt, and you have a timestamp. Pretty common, right? We're going to be using that a bunch of different places. Right? Here's another pattern. 400 by 300 thumbnail image, a headline, and an excerpt, right? Again, common pattern. You probably see this on a lot of sites or whatever. But so these were some of the patterns we came up with. In order to actually make this happen, right, we use a templating language called Mustache to stitch these things together. So in order to create this pattern, whenever you look at the HTML underlying it, you see a little bit of HTML, right? Block post is what we're calling that, I guess. And all those bits in orange in the double curly braces that look like little mustaches, hence the name, are mustache code, right? So we have a dynamic URL, we have a dynamic headline, and a dynamic excerpt, right? And so that's going to come in handy later, but for now I'm filling that with the placeholder images and the lorem ipsum. But the big thing here is this little greater than sign, right? So what we're doing is we're saying that's an include, right? So I'm saying, hey, Pattern Lab, include a pattern called an atom called thumb, right? Which is that thing, right? That 400 by 300 image. So what Pattern Lab does is it goes, okay, I'm going to go find this thumbnail image and suck it into this little block of code, right? So now I have this little reusable chunk of markup that I can now use that same greater than include pattern to include in even bigger patterns. So at the organism level, if we take a look at their heading, or their header for the site, this pretty common pattern, right? You can see there's a logo, there's a primary navigation, there's a little search form tucked away. And so whenever you look at the code for that, you see a little header tag, and then we're including the logo atom, we're including the primary navigation molecule, we're including the search form molecule. And again, once we have that going, then we could include that in even bigger components, right, into our templates. So you can sort of see where this is going, right? It's just like Russian nesting dolls, right? It's just like the little things are included in the bigger things, which are included in the even bigger things, and so on. And what this does, by setting things up in this way, it allows us to change one pattern. In any instance of that pattern, we'll just magically update, right? That is like, it's amazing. It's like, oh, this broke, right? Or this thing just doesn't work, or it's not performant, or it's not accessible, right? So instead of having to go through and hunt through every instance of your tabs or your accordions or whatever, it's like, boom, right? Update it once, update the pattern, and anywhere that's included will magically update as well. So then we get into the template stage. So again, the template stage is is articulating that underlying content structure, right? Which is really super helpful for the content editors themselves, but also for the CMS team, but also for the design team, just to know sort of the rules and the constraints around the content. So we have this big hero image. We have a little headline sitting on top of that. And as we scroll down, you could sort of see a couple patterns repeating again and again, right? So all we're doing is just including those the same way that we are including the other patterns. Only this time, we're wrapping them in a little name, right? So we're wrapping the hero in this little # hero thing. And that's just to sort of give it a name that will come in handy at the next stage. So at the page stage, what we're doing, again, is replacing that underlying content skeleton with real, actual content. So in the case of Time Inc., we're taking this homepage template, which I will say doesn't look terribly inspiring, right, at the template level, but we're replacing that with pictures of Beyonce, which, as I found out on this project, and we all found this out, quickest way to get design approval, pictures of Beyonce. Beyonce is universally loved by everyone. It's like the fast-track design approval. So even if you're a government employee or you're working on some like big intranet or enterprise site or whatever, pictures of Beyonce. It is like all the stakeholders will just be like, yeah, sure, this looks great, ship it. Pro tip. But so you can see, again, we're replacing our template stuff with the picture of Beyonce. We're replacing our tagline with their actual tagline, moving people or whatever. You can see that we now have a picture of an ice skater with a dynamic headline here. And as we sort of scroll down, you could see all of those patterns, right, now populated with different content, right? These different instances of the pattern now have their own unique content to them. And the way that we're doing that is just is by swapping out some JSON, right? So we have sort of a default data sort of JSON file where we're establishing here's that grayscale image, here's that Lorem Ipsum text, and then we're sort of going in at the page level and saying, okay, for the hero, right, I want the headline to be moving people, right, instead of that Lorem Ipsum text. And instead of that big grayscale image, I want to swap that out with hero_Beyonce.jpg or WebP or whatever. Sorry, that's all the responsive image stuff is like still over my head. I'm like, I need to. Okay, I'm still reeling from this morning at my inadequacy as a web developer. Anyways, experience. Here's another thing, right? So we're swapping in for the experience section. We're saying, okay, I want, instead of that grayscale image, I want the hero_skater.jpg, and I want to give it this headline, this excerpt, and so on and so forth, right? And this allows us, again, to sort of keep things, this notion of keeping things dry, right? Don't repeat yourself. You're able to have a pattern, and if you want to make a bunch of instances of that pattern, you could do that. And by changing just that one underlying pattern, you can make all these great changes in addition to that and sort of pump it full of dynamic content. So you're creating this clean separation between the underlying structure and the content and the data that goes into that structure. It also includes pseudo patterns, which is sort of like a nerdy name. I didn't come up with that. But you might have various instances where, let's say you have a web app or some sort of dashboard or whatever. The user logs in and they see a page, and maybe it has all of their recent activity and so on and so forth, right? But maybe you have different levels of users, right? Maybe you have an admin, and you want to switch on additional controls for that administrator, right? So things like edit buttons and delete buttons and stuff that a regular user wouldn't have. Well, with Pattern Lab, you could actually quite easily do that by defining a little variable to say user is admin true, and inside of your patterns you could say if the user is an admin, then show this additional stuff, right? So it won't be there by default. And again, this helps keep things dry and helps keep you from having to like duplicate an entire Photoshop document in order to just add a couple buttons or whatever, right? So in addition to stitching together all of these atoms, molecules, organisms, templates, and pages, we also have a viewer. And it's really apparent now, especially now, that values like 320 pixels, right, which is an iPhone 4 in portrait view, or 480 pixels, which is an iPhone 4 in landscape view, 768 an iPad in portrait view, right, 1024 an iPad in landscape view, or desktop browser, right? These values just don't mean anything, right? They have no place inside of our code, inside of our media queries, inside of our Photoshop documents. The fold, right? Oh God, the fold, right? That old conversation, right? So I made a tool called Ish, and that's baked into Pattern Lab. And the reason why it's called Ish is that you click on the small button, and it gives you a small-ish viewport. You click on the small button again, it gives you another small-ish viewport. Click on the medium button, it gives you a medium-ish viewport, and so on and so forth. So you get the idea. It's like what we're doing is we're trying to get this point across to our clients, to our colleagues, to ourselves even, that, yeah, we're not just creating for the popular device widths of today. It's our job, our responsibility as web designers to craft user experiences, UIs, that are going to look and function beautifully no matter what the viewport is. So that's what Ish does. There's also the sort of client favorite disco mode. So you turn on disco mode and the viewport like bounces all over the place. And the client loves it, and they're like, look at it go, like, this is amazing. And it's like, it's sort of cheeky. It's not exactly like the best web developer design tool in the world, but again, it's just there to reinforce this notion that it's like, yeah, we're making these fully fluid user interfaces. There's also annotations that allows us to sort of suck in all of that really relevant stuff that typically gets thrown away inside of some PDF wireframe document somewhere, and actually bake that into the living, breathing code, and you could see that in context. And you could also sort of see it in like your pattern list view, right? So this was for Time Inc., so we're able to say blah, 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 our fonts are coming from Typekit, and so on and so forth, right? Makes documentation a lot better. There's also this notion of lineage, right? I mentioned earlier how I was sort of frustrated with a lot of different pattern libraries out there because you don't really get a sense of context. Like, where do these things actually get used, right? Where does blocks 3 up get used? Well, within Pattern Lab, just because we're doing that sort of include type sort of setup, that Russian nesting doll approach, we could sort of pull out, we could say, okay, this pattern, right, this block media link pattern contains the following patterns. This atom square, right, this little thumbnail square image that I'm rounding with CSS, right? And it says this pattern is included in the following patterns, right? It's included in the profile navigation, some pattern called section media list, our account settings, and our edit account settings, right? So what makes this really powerful is that says, like, okay, if this breaks or if I need to make changes to it, I know exactly where I need to go to retest and sort of refactor things and make sure that nothing broke in the process, right? So it sort of automatically does that, which is nice. There's a bunch of other stuff. We're working on a new version. And again, it's an open source tool, like, and I'm not really here to sell you on one specific tool. In fact, that sort of worries me. You know, I'm not here to sell you on one thing. I think that all those features that I just sort of went over, I think, are good considerations no matter what sort of pattern library, strategy, or tool you end up using. I think that they're just good considerations to factor in. But if you do want to check it out, it's patternlab.io. If things go wrong, don't blame me. That is my way of washing my hands of the matter. Right, so we got a methodology. We have, you know, a way of executing that methodology. But then there's the real rub, right? Which is how the hell do we update our workflows in order to make this stuff happen, right? And I asked a while ago, I said, you know, what's the hardest part of responsive web design? Is it responsive images? Is it grids and stuff like that? Or is it updating your process, your workflow, people? Right? Just overwhelmingly, people are like, yep, it's people. Right? Mark Bolton has this great line. He says, the design process is weird and complicated because it involves people who are weird and complicated. I think that that's pretty accurate. So I had the good fortune of working on a few projects where we were able to really explore what a sound responsive process looked like, what a good process for establishing and executing a pattern-based workflow looked like. One of these projects was for Entertainment Weekly, responsive site for them, TechCrunch, which is a technology blog owned by AOL, and Time Inc., which I've sort of mentioned already. So I'll sort of just walk you through what we did to execute these projects, which I think went, all in all, pretty well. So the first thing was really resetting people's expectations. Does this look familiar to anybody? Let's review the website. Get a conference room, all right, book the conference room. Bill's going to go to the printer and print off a copy of the deck for everybody. You awkwardly make small talk as Bill's, waiting for Bill to come back, right? Bill comes back, passes around the room, right, the conference table. You get out the red pens, right? This is about as far away from interacting with the website as you could get, right? Dan Mall, who I had the real good fortune of working with on these projects, he says, as an industry, we have this tendency to sell websites like paintings, right? Instead, we should be selling beautiful and easy access to content, agnostic of device, screen size, or context. And I just absolutely love that notion. So in order to accomplish this, we really have to kill this outdated, sort of siloed notion of the waterfall process. Right? You know what I'm talking about. The client comes, right? You get the project, and then some UX designer or information architect or interaction designer, whatever you want to call them, right? They go away and they make this 200-page PDF, right? And we show it to the client, right? What do you think? They're like, yeah, this looks like what we talked about, and cool, yeah, for the most part, sure. And then it's like, all right, cool. And then they pass that off to the visual designer, right? The visual designer takes that 200-page PDF and colors inside the line. No, just kidding. They apply thoughtfully typography, color, and texture, and all that great stuff, to these designs. And we come back to the client. And we say, what do you think? Right? And they're like, yeah, this looks pretty good. This feels right, and blah, blah, blah. Can we just, we're like, yeah, sure, no problem. And then we go away, and we're like, and we come back, and then we're like, version 2, what do you think? And they're like, yeah, that's great. That's exactly what I was talking about. This is cool. Can we just do a little? And then we're like, yeah, sure, no problem. And then we go away, and then we do, and then we come back, and we're like, version 3, what do you think? And they're like, yeah. That's awesome. I really like what was going on in V1. Can we bring a little bit of that? And we're like, yeah, sure. And then we're like, yeah. And we do this, right? Until eventually, right, we have homepage _ V7 _ V final _ for dev review _ for client presentation _ final _ .v2 _ for Brad _ V17 final .psd, right? And then very quietly, right, whenever that finally gets approved, right, the designer tiptoes quietly over to the code cave, right? Slips the designs under the door. As they tiptoe away, they're like, please get this done in 2 weeks. We're already behind time and budget and all that stuff, right? And they run off into the darkness. And then the developers crawl out of the cave, and they pick up the design off the floor, right? And they're like, this is all wrong. You're all a bunch of assholes. Right? You're clapping because you've lived it, right? And of course, this is just not at all what we need to be doing in order to do good work. I sort of suffer from an identity crisis, right? And Eric sort of introduced me. He's like, oh, design development. It's like whenever I'd get hired at jobs, they'd go, oh, well, what do you do? And I said, well, mostly focus on HTML and CSS and JavaScript poorly or whatever. And they're like, oh, you're a coder. Well, we've got a place for you, right? Go over and sit with those Ruby folks. Whip us up some gems. And I'm like, yeah. And they're like, so how long is it going to take you to write this middleware? And I'm like, my mom is an art teacher. I've never had a computer science class in my life. Like, this is very uncomfortable for me, right? Like, yes, I'm writing code. I'm writing HTML and CSS and JavaScript poorly. I'm more akin to the Photoshop people and to the Wireframe people, right, than I am to the sort of database normalizing hardcore programmers. So it's a very weird place to be if you're in the front end boat, and I see some nodding heads. It's like, yeah, I think we're all sort of suffering through this identity crisis. Right? But at the same time, we are the ones, right, the people that are actually executing this stuff that actually, sort of have their nose to the grindstone, right, and know sort of the realities of the browser, what's possible, right? Like Jen's talk is so great because it's like, Photoshop designers aren't reading up on VWs, right, and stuff like that. It's like, so it really requires this marriage of all of these disciplines working together in order to actually create successful projects. And that's not to say everybody needs to be guns blazing the whole time and that the project manager needs to just wall out everybody's time equally. No, like that's not it. In our experience, it looks a little something like this, right? Where of course at the beginning of the project, the information architect or the UX designer or whatever, they're burning hot, right? They're producing a lot of things. They're making a lot of things happen. But that doesn't mean that the web designer, the visual designer, and the developers need to sit on their hands, right? There's a lot that can be done. So that's resetting expectations, right? With our clients, with ourselves, with our colleagues. Once we get into that, then we can sort of start gathering things up. So in addition to doing good user research and competitive research and all that stuff, we could also start setting the groundwork for our pattern library. So this is a tool called Stylify Me, which allows you to take any URL, you slap it in there, and it goes through and it spits back all of the colors and font families and font sizes and stuff you use on your production CSS. Pretty cool. And it's like, boom, there's a style guide, right? Or at least the beginnings of one, right? So this is a great tool to sort of kickstart this idea of like, well, what is our UI made of? Another exercise I find tremendously helpful is what I call an interface inventory. And if you're familiar with this notion of a content inventory, it's this big, tedious, laborious process that happens whenever we execute, a redesign, hopefully. Right? But even though it's this tedious process, it's tremendously beneficial. So we could do that same sort of inventory, only instead of documenting our unique content types, we're documenting our unique patterns. Right? So this is my bank. Do you feel sorry for me? Like, it's pretty rough right here, right? And this is just going through a couple pages, right? These are just some of the buttons that I encountered, right? So this idea of the interface inventory allows us to sort of go through and start documenting all these unique instances of patterns and saying, okay, yeah, here's what all of our sort of form fields are looking like. Here's what our buttons are looking like. Here's our icons, our different image types, our different sort of block elements, all of our different form elements, our tables, interactive widgets, and so on and so forth. Right? If you contrast my bank with a site like Etsy, right, who runs a very tight style guide-driven shop, right, you can see that their button styles are just a hell of a lot more deliberate, right, and intentional, and consistent, and cohesive. As Laura mentioned earlier, there's these opportunities to sort of look for instances where maybe there's an opportunity to sort of merge some of these patterns together, right? Sort of blend these things together or maybe kill some stuff off, right? And that's not just great for performance, right? That's great for establishing a sound, resilient, flexible style guide that you could live with and grow with and test on again and again, right? So conducting an interface inventory is tremendously helpful. You're documenting your interface. You're highlighting all the inconsistencies. You're establishing the scope of work for sort of, refactoring things into a responsive environment, right? And you're really laying that groundwork for a future style guide or pattern library, right? So helpful to have all the people that touch a site or an app or service or whatever in one room, all sort of doing this exercise together, because this is where that shared vocabulary starts gelling, right? You have people go, oh, I call this button the main button, and then the other people go, well, we call this primary button, and the developers go, well, we mark it up as this, right? And so you start having a conversation about, well, what do we call our stuff, right? And then also having those conversations about, well, which patterns should stay, which patterns should go, right? Which ones could be merged together, right? These are all really helpful conversations. And the end result of this exercise, you're able to take, I usually use like Google Slides, and you have everybody sort of merge them all into one Uber document. And you can print that out and put that on the CEO's desk, right? You look at all the button styles, and they don't need to be a developer or a designer to go, yeah, that's problematic. We should probably do something about that, right? So it's a great way to get buy-in. So once we're done with gathering, then we start establishing our design direction. A friend of mine is a preschool teacher in Washington, D.C. And one day, one of her students asked, how do you make a website? And my friend was like, well, as it turns out, we're friends with, I have a friend that's a web designer. So they gave us a FaceTime call. And Ava, this 6-year-old girl, asks, how do you make a website? And I was like, well, it's typically a good idea to sort of, draw a picture of what you want that website to be. And about an hour later, I get this picture message back from my friend. And I looked at it, and I'm like, oh, that's awesome. And I looked at it again, and I was like, holy shit. This girl is like better than 90% of the designers I've ever worked with, right? Like clear labeling, right? Proper hierarchy, color coding, freaking active states, right? She's 6. It's insane, right? Here's the homepage. So you have, again, beautiful layout, proper hierarchy, more active states. Her freaking buttons are more consistent than my bank. It's awesome. And what I love about this is it's just, in an hour, a 6-year-old is able to build, design something. I could build this right this second. I could build this right now, right? And I think that we've sort of, I don't know why we do this, but we have this idea of like, we need to have all these really high fidelity ideas, especially early in the process, in the wireframing stage and all of that stuff. We do all these 200-page PDF high fidelity wireframes. And it's like, we don't need to do that. We just need to get the ideas out, right? Jason Santamaria has a great line. He says, ideas are meant to be ugly. Right? It's about getting those ideas out and getting those into the final environment as quickly as possible to more sooner, validate or invalidate those ideas. So I had the good fortune of working with Jennifer Brook, who's an amazing designer. She used to work at the New York Times. And this was some of the stuff that we were delivering to our TechCrunch client, right? So her sketching tool of choice was Keynote. And she, one of the first things we showed is we said, look, we're going to have a few of these patterns that we're going to reuse again and again throughout the experience, right? So we're going to have a featured area. And you can see it's just very suggestive, right? There's nothing, there's no content, there's no lorem ipsum, there's no layout, there's no nothing. It's just like we're going to have an area where we're going to feature some stuff, right? And we're going to have an area where we're going to sort of list a bunch of news stories in some particular order. And we're going to have a grid that might, contain some stuff as well. Right? So this is what we're talking about, just very lo-fi, just getting the point across, getting the, helping the clients get on board with this pattern-based workflow. And from a visual design standpoint, instead of coming out of the gates with all these full-fledged comps, right, it's about using things like style tiles, right, which has been discussed in the past and stuff. So, like instead of coming out of the gates with these high fidelity comps, it's like let's instead get an idea of what the client values and what they don't value, what sort of vibe they're going for. Show them color suggestions or some experiments in typography or textures, things like that, right? To give an idea of what they actually care about, right? Same thing goes with typography. We use a tool called Typecast to pair together different fonts. And Dan Mall would show them, here's some different font pairings, right? Here's what we have in mind, and would number them. And we'd say, here's why we chose these things. And the sort of things that we're looking for from the client is, oh yeah, like that, I really like the feel of that one, or that feels on brand, or oh, this feels a little too conservative, or this feels too blocky or cartoony, right? And so we're able to get a really good feel for what they care about, what they don't care about, without having to do a whole hell of a lot of work. Right? And from a front-end development standpoint, I was able to get started on the project, starting coding day one of the project. And I don't think that is all that amazing of an idea. I think that, what a lot of developers need to do is sort of the equivalent of what a prep chef does at a restaurant, right? In the restaurant, you have the prep chef, and they come in, and they're preparing the salads, and they're marinating the meat, and they're chopping the carrots and the onions and all that stuff in advance, right? So that whenever everybody comes into the restaurant the next day, right, everyone can work together to work and focus on constructing meals rather than somebody going, oh, hang on, I need to go chop 70 carrots. Right? So I think that we as developers need to do a better job at sort of doing that prep chef work, doing that preparation work, so that we could spend more time collaborating with designers, with all the other people involved in the project. So for the TechCrunch project, well, I knew we were going to have a newsletter sign-up form. I knew we were going to have a site search. I knew we were going to use a third party for our commenting. I knew we were going to have a contact form. I knew this was a publication, so we'd have things like block quotes and pull quotes. I knew this thing was supported by ads, so instead of pretending that ads didn't exist, which whatever, we could address that right out of the gate and sort of make spots for those and get those into the templates as quickly as possible. So once we're done with that, once we have this sort of prep work done, once we have a firm sort of solid overarching direction, then we could really roll up our sleeves, right? And from a wireframe stage, this was Jennifer's wireframe for the homepage, and this is as high fidelity as she ever got, right? It's just, here's what content goes on the page and in what general order, right? That's all it needs to be, right? And we'd have conversations with the client. And what's great about this is that I could sort of figuratively look over her shoulder and put that into the browser. And so this is like 2 weeks into the project or whatever, and I have the homepage more or less constructed. It looks like crap, but that's okay, right? I'm just sort of doing this, sort of stitching things together, getting that plumbing work done together, or getting that plumbing work done so that we can collaborate on the actual design later. And Dan would do what he calls element collages, which is sort of applying those style tiles to actual interface elements. And having conversations with the client to say, how's this feeling, right? This isn't necessarily, approval, yes or no. This is more like, are we going in the right direction? Does this feel on brand? Does this feel like what you have in mind? Still pretty exploratory. But we'd be able to take one particular organism, right? One particular sort of, high profile one, like a header, and design that and put that in front of the clients and have a conversation. And all the while, I'd be in the background, again, putting that into the browser. And as we'd have our client calls and stuff, I'd be there sort of making changes live in the browser and stuff like that. So it was really nice. And we were able to iterate on that until we arrived at our final solutions. And so we'd end up in these sort of weird places wherever some components would be done, but the other ones wouldn't be. But and if you look at this like in abstract, it's like, what the hell is this, right? It's like, a client would be like, you're fired, right? But because we're constantly communicating, collaborating with them, they're along for the ride. They're seeing this thing evolve. So instead of saying like, what is this sort of half-done piece of crap, right? They're rather saying, oh, cool, like the header's done, like that's cool, right? Let's make more progress. It's only really here that we go into full comps, right? So once we have a good idea of our overarching direction and some main patterns sort of, designed and sort of have a good idea around that, then we go into Photoshop and put it all together And we missed the mark a couple of times, and we had to do a V2 of a comp or whatever. But once we started getting feedback like, could we put like a gray line around the article, or can we move this here to here? We're like, yeah, cool, we'll do that, but we're going to do that in the browser, right? Rather than creating yet another Photoshop comp. It's just a lot easier to iterate there. So that became our process, right? We have sort of design going on, we have development going on concurrently. We're sort of putting in that design into the browser, testing it across the different viewpoints, testing it on real devices, all this stuff, validating and invalidating those design decisions. What's fascinating is that, Dan, who was doing a lot of the work in Photoshop and stuff like that, we sort of figured out like about 3/4 of the way through the project, we're like, this is sort of weird, because like 90% of the work that he was doing in Photoshop was never seen by the client. It was like for my eyes only. It was for us to solve the problem together. And we'd work together to put that into the browser, and then we'd show them the in-browser result. So, okay, so we're not doing waterfall, so you must be doing agile. I get that a lot. Agile's sort of a loaded word. But yeah, at the end of the day, is it agile? It's like, I don't think so. It's just, it doesn't really matter what you call this process. I think that, the key points here are that the collaboration and the communication between all the disciplines with the client themselves matters more than whatever the hell you call your process. And it matters more than whatever deliverables you end up creating, right? So, this is our reality, right? This is our sort of tear-inducing multi-device reality, right? And this is really hard. It's really difficult to change, but it's absolutely essential for us to do so. And this line from Benjamin Franklin really, I think, rings true today, right? When you're finished changing, you're finished. And I think that that's especially true in a medium that's only 25 years old. And for as hard as all this stuff is, it's a hell of a lot of fun, right? I played with a lot of Legos as a kid. I don't know about you all, but like this ain't all that different. And I think that's pretty cool. We just get paid for it now, right? That's pretty awesome. So with that, if you're interested in learning more, I'm writing a book on the subject. You could pre-order it. It's all live online right now. You could pre-order it for $10 if you want to learn more. So with that, thank you very much for your time.